We all love it, don't we? We watch these films for the thrill. We choose to let ourselves be taken into the dark corners in the shadows where the monsters lurk. And just like the stupid characters that inhabit a lot of these films, we leave the light off as we go investigate that noise in the basement, which is obviously just a cat. I've been letting these films scare, shock and disturb me from a fairly young age, and it's definitely not done me any harm. But in the 21st century, horror has gone through a shift. Horror is now, shock horror, mainstream. Has the Stranger Things of the world made horror too living room friendly? Or are there still viable options to make our flesh crawl? Thankfully, I think there have been tons of amazing horrors in the 2000s, so many I had real trouble narrowing this list down to my favourite 20. And we have it all in here: vampires, zombies, ghosts, creature features, extreme horror, found footage and more. First, as is the way with these lists, I have to begin with some horror honourable mentions. Paranormal Activity was almost as important as the Blair Witch Project in establishing the found footage genre, once again proving that this was one of the best types of film to earn major return on investment. In fact, Paranormal Activity holds the record of likely being the best ever return of investment in movie history. Costing just $15,000 to make, it went on to take almost $200 million at the box office, giving it a ridiculous 434,000% profit return. It also made me scared to go to bed for a week. Danny Boyle's visceral and nasty zombie film was one of the very first to popularise fast zombies. Yes, I know that they're infected with rage, but they're zombies. I feel some of the stylistic choices that Boyle uses here are starting to look a bit dated now, and there's a fair amount of questionable acting from the supporting cast. But this is a notable and important British horror. Sam Raimi crashes the zooms and whips the pans to maximum effect in this 2009 supernatural horror, which was sadly the last time Raimi helmed a pure horror. I feel this one is a bit of an underrated gem, and it also features one of the most devastating rug pull endings of recent memory. What at first seems like a new take on Raimi's Evil Dead, Cabin in the Woods soon turns into one of the most entertaining, meta and original horrors of the century. And finally, Lake Mungo, a cross between a pseudo-documentary and a found footage horror, this ever-evolving true crime style mystery has one of the single most what the absolute fuck moments in all of horror. Right, let's get to the 20.
Get on with it. Yes, get on with it.
We start my list with what I feel is the most underrated and underseen film of the 20. Not to be confused with The Relic, starring Tom Sizemore, which is not even from the 2000s, so why are you even bringing it up? Relic, written and directed by Natalie Erica Jones, is one of those horror movies where the horror is a metaphor for something else. In this instance, dementia and death. It works as a family drama just as much as a creepy horror mystery, and it has one of the most striking and brave endings I've ever seen in this genre. If you like your horror more slow burn and thoughtful, you'll love Relic.
Sometimes the world of the dead gets mixed up with the world of the living.
Like all the very best big twist films, The Others still works on a rewatch, but you're granted another layer, watching how much the film dares to drip feed you without revealing its hand too early. We don't get many of these classic style ghost stories anymore, probably because they've been done to death in the past, but this film feels bold and original despite its classic stylings. I don't really like the section with Christopher Eccleston, it feels a little pointless and slows the pacing, but otherwise this is probably the best classic ghost film of this century. And whilst the twist almost seems obvious and basic now, in 2001 it was making Jaws hit the floor across the world.
That cold ain't the weather. That's death approaching.
30 Days of Night is one of a very select number of films where I'm pretty sure I like it much more than most people, but I also have better taste than most people, so that scans. I've always thought this was an excellent and visceral vampire horror with a fantastic premise. The vampires are a constant threat and they're feral and animalistic, and yet at the same time gothic and grand design makes them a terrifying proposition. Danny Huston's commanding performance as the lead vampire and the guttural but majestic language they speak just adds another layer of fear. The gore and effects are superb and still hold up 15 years later. That axe to the head scene at the end is incredibly impressive. The film slows down a touch once it becomes a bit more cat and mouse, and the characters are disappointingly thin, but this has everything I need for an entertaining and exciting horror. Dread, tension, style, gore and stakes. Stakes. A lot of people are wary of found footage horror because there are so many cheap cash-in efforts out there, and this is a subgenre filled with a lot of crap, let's be honest. Because of this, I'd put off watching Hell House LLC until fairly recently, but that was a major mistake because this is a proper horror which doesn't pull any punches with the scares. You can tell when a horror has done its job if you turn all the lights on in the house after it's finished, and that's exactly what I did after watching this. Yes, as usual, it suffers from the found footage issue where they simply wouldn't be filming in certain parts, but I thought it would better here than in most FF films, and also they would all just run away and leave that place forever. The scares are genuinely brilliant though. It really got to me at some points, and it's very rare for horrors to do that these days. The girl sat against the wall, the mannequin... Jesus. The first foreign language film on this list, but not the last, is another excellent example of found footage done right. This is horror at its purest level, intense and claustrophobic, and is especially scary for anyone who doesn't like stairs. Daleks, for example. There's very little fat on the bones of Wreck, and at 78 minutes, it's a thrill ride which gives horror fans exactly what they want without any padding. There's a little sense of, it's a zombie, run upstairs. It's a zombie, run downstairs. But because of the short run time, this doesn't have the chance to get too old. Also, the last few minutes of this film are underwear-destroyingly tense. Before we get into the top 15, as you've started watching this video, you have been cursed by YouTube, and the amount of adverts you'll see on each video will now be double. Quickly click on that like and subscribe button before the end of the video, and the curse will be lifted. The great poet Kyle Reese once wrote, "Listen and understand. That Terminator is out there. It can't be bargained with. It can't be reasoned with. It doesn't feel pity or remorse or fear, and it absolutely will not stop ever until you are dead." This might as well be the IMDb description for It Follows, though you'd probably have to drop the Terminator mention because that wouldn't make sense. This is how you make a simple horror film with a basic premise into something striking and memorable. Every horror fan who has seen this film still remembers the first time they saw the tall man striding across the hall towards our hero. It's just one of those all-time horror moments. It Follows completely understands that what you don't see, what you don't know, can be 10 times more terrifying than the opposite. It's an excellent film, but I wasn't a great fan of the sequel, which for some reason, instead of calling it It Follows 2, they went with Smile. Weird.
Get out.
Get out. Get out. Get out.
Get out.
Probably the least horror-y horror on this list. I'm sure some people wouldn't even call it horror, but of course those people would be incorrect. Get Out has a simple but absolutely brilliant and unguessable concept. It's focused, it's cool, it's super entertaining, and of course it has the insanely good Daniel Kaluuya in the lead. I understand that Jordan Peele's success, skill and likeability means he's been able to up the scale of his films from Get Out to Us to Nope, but I do hope he comes back to this more simple, contained story, as I've liked each of his subsequent films less than the one that preceded it. So I'm starting this one by choosing violence and potentially pissing off two sets of fans. One, I prefer this so-called remake over Romero's original. Sorry, I just do. And two, this is the only Zack Snyder film I really enjoy. I would even go as far to say that the opening 5 minutes of Snyder's Dawn of the Dead is better than any of his other films. This film has got it all. The film's main character, played by now Oscar-winning writer-director Sarah Polley, is an excellent hero to root for. There's bundles of cool from Ving Rhames as always, and Ty Burrell makes for a brilliantly hateable douche. There's a zombie baby, a severed zombie head in a bucket, and it may also have been one of the first films to use the now ubiquitous use of unlikely covers of edgy tracks, with Richard Cheese's swing jazz version of Disturbed's Down with the Sickness. Wahahaha indeed.
Something in the mist! Shut the doors! Shut the doors!
Just like with The Walking Dead, it's not the zombies, or in this case great hulking Cthulhu-style beasts, which are the real monsters. It's us, the shitty humans. And The Mist features one of the shittiest of shitty horror movie humans in Mrs. Carmody. She's essentially a religious zealot version of Nurse Ratched, but even more unlikable. This is another horror with a bit of everything. You've got the unknown, some gooey slithery stuff, creepy spider creatures with acid webs, massive ground-shaking titans, and of course, some really shitty humans. But we all know the big talking point of The Mist, don't we? Yes, that hilarious and yet wholesome ending that none of us saw coming.
and I got lots of peas.
The film which may have started the mainstream horror trend, this super glossy, true story but obviously isn't actually a true story ghost movie, is full of standout spooky moments. Similarly to the others, The Conjuring isn't really doing anything new or original, but fresh ideas and energy can always come from a young director eager to make his mark on the big time, and this film certainly had one. This is essentially a bundled up remake of all the haunted house films from the 70s and 80s, but it's just done so bloody well. And yeah, all the banging doors, clapping hands and ghostly goings on are scary, but the absolutely scariest part of The Conjuring, the family that were haunted had 5 girls. 5! This is absolutely terrifying. Have you hit that like and subscribe button yet? This YouTube curse is no laughing matter. You are going to be inundated with Manscaped and Squarespace adverts. You've been warned. Oh, good Neil Marshall, how we miss you, and we continue to hope that one day you'll return to us. The Descent is a kind of classic, isn't it? It's a perfect what-if horror scenario. What if a group of women, several of which have beefs against each other, go on a horribly claustrophobic caving expedition? What if they then get trapped and their light sources are limited? That's enough for most of us. That right there is more than enough horror. But then what if there's bloodthirsty, vicious, cave-dwelling beasts who are blind but have insanely good hearing? It's horror ecstasy. You don't get many horrors where all the family can gather round, each enjoying the thrills in different ways. And Martyrs doesn't buck that trend because it's absolutely fucking horrible and should only be watched by true horror purists. Martyrs is brutal, violent, horrific, disturbing, gory and nasty, but unlike with a lot of extreme French horror that came out around the same time, there is a point to all the violence, and it's integral to the story as hard as it is to stomach. This is a film about violence and pain and the trauma it causes. It depicts trauma, depression, self-harm and suicide in a very clever way, which I imagine could be cathartic to some, though horrifically triggering to others. The first time I saw Martyrs, its shocking and bold ending left me in quite an odd state for a couple of days, questioning what it all meant, and even what it all means.
Wouldst thou like to live deliciously?
Shockingly, The Witch didn't quite land with me on first watch. Perhaps because it was wildly different from what I expected it to be, or maybe because it was my first Robert Eggers film and my brain just wasn't in tune with his horror sensibilities. After loving The Lighthouse, I went back to The Witch, and silly old me, it's really bloody good, isn't it? Anya Taylor-Joy and Ralph Ineson are masterstrokes of casting. They both so wholly inhabit these roles, it feels like they were born to play these characters. The real star of the show, though, is Black Phillip, played by GOAT actor Charlie. Charlie decided, on receiving the script, that he was going to go method and play it pure GOAT, taking his role so seriously that he rammed Ineson on the 4th day of shooting, tearing a tendon in his ribs. Ineson and Charlie never saw eye to horn through the rest of the shoot, which I feel imprinted on the film and created a believable on-screen animosity. Anyway, The Witch is a great horror film, or should I say, Eggercellent. No, I probably shouldn't. Not my favourite zombie movie of the century, but definitely my favourite serious zombie movie, which will give you a clue to one of the films left in this list, but it's also on the thumbnail, so you should already know. Train to Busan is an absolute beauty, and it gets right what so many zombie movies get wrong. At its centre, it gives you flawed characters who are believable and very easy to love, hate, and just feel something for. Once that is set, the intense action, of which there is a ton in this film, all feels so much more nerve-wracking. You want the failing father to come good and do right by his daughter. You want the father to make it and be as good a dad as he hopes. And you want the selfish businessman to be torn apart by the hordes. Films involving children, especially horrors, can be made or broken by the child actors. And thankfully, Train to Busan has Soo-Ann Kim, who will tear the heart from your chest with her piercing cries. And I just don't know how I feel about the upcoming American remake. If I wrote a horror film, it would probably be like A Quiet Place, though definitely not as good, because I've never written a film before. It's just my kind of film. Taut, sleek, economical, tense as hell, and with the very best kind of simple, unobtrusive story exposition. The creature design and effects are top-notch and absolutely terrifying. Plus it features my favourite Hollywood couple, John Krasinski, who I definitely have a bit of a man crush for, and Emily Blunt, who I just have a very standard heterosexual crush for. Where was I? Oh yeah, Quiet Place. It's pretty damn good. Okay, YouTube people, as we get to my top 5, why not roast me in the comments and let me know which films' inclusion in this top 20 you find reprehensible, and also which films am I crazy to have left out. I'm sure I will give your measured comments an appropriately thoughtful response. Another 2000s film where horror is a metaphor for something else, in this case, grief, depression and guilt. A lot of people struggle with this film because of how stress-inducing the kid is, and yeah, I totally get that. But this is a great exploration of how maternal guilt and depression can threaten to destroy a mother-child relationship, and how that can be stretched even further by the ever-looming presence of a creepy circus freak with stabby fingers. If you can't get past that annoying kid, you're missing out on an incredibly well-made movie, made on a tiny budget, with brain-searing sinister imagery and some Oscar-worthy acting from Essie Davis.
겁나 무섭지라. 무섭긴 무엇이.
I really enjoyed The Wailing first time round, but liked it significantly more on a rewatch. It's the kind of film which really does benefit from repeat viewings. South Korea is the only country which could make a film like this. It's funny, creepy, moving, deep, striking, and most importantly, entertaining from start to finish. Cast are all amazing, so many committed and full-on performances. Does any other country produce so many convincing child actors as South Korea? Hwan Hee Kim is gut-wrenchingly brilliant as Hyo Jin. I have to admit I find the last 30 minutes a little confusing as to what's going on, who's who has which intentions, etc. But even not quite having a handle on proceedings, my enjoyment isn't diminished at all. If the ending lands you in the same boat, my old mate Stu over at Stu Talks has got a brilliant breakdown video. Really recommend checking it out.
Purple Rain? No. Sign of the Times? Definitely not. The Batman soundtrack? Throw it.
One of the most quotable and likeable horror comedies ever made. Sean gets right what so many comedy horrors get wrong. It's a funny comedy, and it's a tense and occasionally very gory horror. It's a real feat to get that balance correct, and not many films manage it. Simon Pegg, Nick Frost and Edgar Wright made it clear from their TV series Space, which preceded Sean, that horror was their thing. Their reference and Easter egg heavy comedy made it over to Sean, bolstered by bigger budget horror and a story filled with heart that is very easy to relate to. I know I've often had the what would I do in a zombie apocalypse daydream, and I do like the choice of heading to the Winchester and wait until it all blows over. This one is almost certainly my favourite ancient vampire pedo grooming horror. Joking aside, because yeah, that was a joke, there aren't many horrors out there who try something different, and that's especially true in the vampire subgenre. This Swedish film, based on an equally brilliant novel by John Lindqvist, takes all the vampire tropes and puts them into a story about loneliness, addiction, childhood angst and isolation. On the surface level, the film is about a seemingly innocent childhood friendship which blossoms into something more, but that something more has exceptionally dark implications. It's not a particularly scary film, though there are some excellent and gory vampire moments, and it often feels more like a drama with horror elements, but it is incredibly striking, original and memorable. I'm going to stick my neck out and say that this film also features the most incredible movie scene ever shot at a swimming pool. They must have gone to great lengths to film it. Tony, where the fuck is my Oscar nomination? Colette, ladies and gentlemen. What a performance. I'll go as far as saying that this could be my favourite ever performance in a horror film. Bold claim, but I'm struggling to think of one I like more. The soul-tearing anguish in her cries after that death, which we all knew was coming because it was so heavily telegraphed. The I'm your mother rant at the dinner table. In a career of wonderful performances, this is Colette's best. Ari Aster writes and directs the shit out of this film. My good lord, what a debut. Imagine having that doll's house bedroom to actual bedroom Zoom match cut thing as one of the first moments in your filmography. People work for decades hoping for a shot that good. Hereditary just gets everything right. We know Tony C is amazing, but then you've also got Alex Wolff, who puts in a performance so committed it left him with scars both mental and physical. Millie Shapiro, in her only film role to date, does so much with near silence. And then there's fantastic support by the ever-reliable Gabriel Byrne and Ann Dowd. Colin Stetson's score is also absolutely magnificent and almost feels like a warped horror film all on its own. Hereditary is just a great horror film start to finish, which also rewards on rewatches due to all the little hidden details, of which there are many. Right, that's the 20 and that's a wrap. Thanks to those who've stayed to the end, and if you've enjoyed this ranking video, perhaps you'll like my ranking of all John Carpenter's films. Thanks for watching.
Game over, man. It's game over.